Okay, great.
Well, we'll have Q&A each other about 20 minutes, so. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be up here. I was joking to Hannah earlier that it's good to have a job that has an office up here because I can work out of our Hamden office and then be here without much juggling. And so I know me and Hannah went back and forth about the dates and the time. And that's one of the reasons why I could just change my schedules because I can just pop over from the office over here. So, but thank you for having me. I often enjoy coming outside of Portland because Portland is its own little bubble. And coming out here, I've been to Bar Harbor, I've been to Ellsworth, I've been to even Bath is a little bit outside of Portland. It's always nice to change sort of my tune and the conversations that I have. The questions are very different and very refreshing. Portland is always the same. So thank you for having me here. A lot of people wonder why someone my age would write a memoir. And I hear them and I see them, and I do agree that oftentimes what we've seen coming out in terms of memoirs are from old fuddy-duddies like Henry Kissinger, who's I think like 90 something now, or those people who have spent their lives doing something at some very high level. But my story is part of a wave of new stories coming from people who are not necessarily 99 years old or have spent their lives at the top levels of government or human rights or the global stage. And I'm especially proud to be a part of a wave of Asian American Pacific Islander authors, writers, storytellers, narratives, and also a part of the larger wave of Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Indigenous writers who are writing their narratives. And one of your locals, Morgan Talty, who wrote what was the name? Do you remember the name?
Night of the Living Res.
Night of the Living Res. Was on the radio today as I was listening and driving here, and he put it very succinctly when he said, the colonial thought was if you want to subjugate a people, you tell their stories for them. And so for me to be a part of a wave of both younger and older folks from different communities who are telling our own stories and challenging the narratives that people were taught and were sold, whether that's through pop culture or history books. I think that's one of the main reasons why I wrote this book was to challenge what I was taught about myself, to challenge what I was raised to believe about myself. And then also to offer other kids who look like me or who can identify with some piece of my story, a path forward in challenging narratives that people might have about them. And so that's one of the reasons why I wrote that one. The other piece was just so I can go around and say I'm an author. That's actually part of the true. I am also Gemini. So if anyone else is Gemini, am I the only Gemini for once? We're known for our boundless curiosity, and we're easily bored. So if you look at my life, I do a lot of different things and wear a lot of hats, and that's because this existential fear of being bored and not doing enough, which does get me into trouble because sometimes I do too much. But writing a book was also me challenging myself to do something that I don't really quite know how to do. Um, and so that's another reason why I wrote the book. If you couldn't gather from the back page, from the memoir, in the book description, I hold a lot of identities that intersect. I'm the son of Cambodian refugees who came to the United States in 1990s, late 1980s. I was born in 91 in California. Ended up in foster care and adopted by families all over Maine, mostly southern Maine. And my family was also religious, my adopted family. And coming out to them was quite the process. And in some ways, I wish I'd come out in high school. But I think out of survival, I came out after I left the house. And so embodying all these different identities, I think finding a way to talk about the story, to write about it, to put it all down in 250 something pages. The book was actually going to be longer, by the way, but they cut down some extra stuff that is stuck in there. Was as much for me to figure out who I was and to write my own story, as much as for any other purpose. I don't earn a lot of royalties from it because it's a small publisher, but for me it was just in one book, my story, how I viewed my upbringing and how I found who I was later in college and in the community service that I do currently. So that's a little bit of how I got into the book, what the book means to me as a 31-year-old person who sometimes people think I have too much time on my hands to be doing this type of stuff. But again, Gemini needs a lot of things to do. So without further ado, I'm just going to read a little bit of a short section from the book. And for later reference, it'll be on page 216. When you get the book later, or if you currently have it, you can follow along as well. And what I'll do is I'll read it, and then I know Hannah just sat down, but I'll bring her back up to kind of have a little bit of a conversation. This part of the book, as you can see, towards the end, and what you'll find is half of the book is spent figuring out, okay, what are my origins? What is my story through up and through adoption? And then the second half is, the halfway point is when I get adopted, when I start struggling with religion and my identity as a gay person. And then the last quarter of the book is me reuniting with my Cambodian family and my Cambodian godparents. So this is in the last portion of the book. Over the course of the 2 weeks, I stayed with my godparents. They shared photos and stories with me from when I was very little. I would talk to them about what I was like then. It was important to me as the person I was at the time, as it is still is today. One story in particular sticks out. We were talking about what I was studying in college and what I wanted to be. They were a little surprised, I suppose, that I was studying politics and was at that time considering going to law school. We always thought you were going to be a doctor, my godmother said. My eyebrows scrunched up ever so slightly. Doctor, I thought. You need to know a little of math and science for that, my weakest subjects. When your godfather was very sick one time, my godmother said, interrupting my train of thought, you kept watch over him and did everything you could to take care of him. So we thought that one day you would be a doctor because you like to help people. This story shattered the narrative I had told myself of how I was as a kid. My experience in foster care, the anger, the feelings of separation and abandonment and such had warped my view of myself. My experience, for instance, with the judge and the owner of the junkyard in Riverton had somehow made me see myself as an angry kid, a thug, someone who bullied. As I jumped from home to home, I could see the fear in the eyes of my foster mother and adoptive parents when I would explode in anger and yell. The look in their eyes made me feel like I was a monster, full of rage, sadness. So I suppose this seeped into my view of what I was like before the age of 9. I also struggled in school, which made me think I was a bad student. But later conversations with Portland teachers I reconnected with told a different story. Sure, I was dealing with a lot of anger, sadness, and feelings of loss, but those feelings didn't define me entirely. My godparents and elementary school teachers and education texts all described me as a kid I barely remembered. Bright, inquisitive, curious, creative, and always willing to lend a helping hand. These were traits that I'd lost in the narrative I'd created about myself as someone who's not only afraid and defensive, but also a person who instilled fear in the eyes of those whose job it was to make me feel safe. This story fit into my status as an quote unquote other, an outsider, someone who hated the fact that I didn't fit in with those around me, that I looked different, that I felt different. It shook me hearing about how my godparents thought I would grow up to be a doctor because of how caring and helpful I was as a young child. It reflected a side of myself I'd forgotten. It felt foreign to me, distant, remote. It created a dissonance in my head and in the core of my being. You mean I wasn't just a messed up kid with a messed up life? I thought to myself. I cared, I helped, I was kind. I knew those things about myself as I sat there with them in their Texas home, but it began to dawn on me that perhaps this had always been me at my very core. From the time when I was a young child, despite the shifting sands of time and the storms roiling inside me, there were parts of me that, although buried at times, shone through all of them. My godparents told story after story about what life was like back then. My godmother told me stories of bath time, rubber duckies, and the time I got soap in my eye. My godfather told me about this time in the Cambodian church and how I would run around during Sunday school and the worship service. Even though I was only their godson, they painted a very vivid picture of presenting me to the world as if I was their very own. Their faces beamed with pride and joy. You are our son, Marpheen, my godfather said, our only son. And we loved you, and we love you still. We still consider you our son. I fought back the tears that were welling up inside. This was part of the journey of finding my place in the world and understanding where I fit in the grand scheme of things. Knowing that I was a part of their lives and that I had a special place in their hearts confirmed that I mattered, that I was loved, and that I had made a difference in their lives, as they had in mine. But being called their son raised other questions for me. Being considered a son carries with it not only a sense of pride, but also a weight of duty. As I felt my roster of parent figures expand, that responsibility seemed to multiply. I wondered whether this feeling of duty to parents was cultural, if it had to do with being the oldest sibling and filling in as much as I could when my birth mother was absent or in need of emotional and personal support. It wasn't until I stumbled on some research about intergenerational transmission of trauma that I began to piece some of this together. My birth family, including my god family, were refugees who escaped genocide and experienced the trauma of seeing their loved ones, friends, and neighbors massacred. I have personally witnessed many of them trying to cope with this trauma by drinking too much or working too much. The ungodly hours and numbers of jobs my elders worked couldn't be explained by simply saying they were hardworking immigrants taking full advantage of newfound opportunities. For the generation of us born in the United States, after our refugee parents landed on these shores, the trauma was passed down to us secondhand. In the least extreme cases, survivors spoke very little about their life during the era of the Khmer Rouge, as if it were a deep, dark secret they wanted to forget. In many cases, it came down to parenting styles. Whether the parent survivor was clingy or overprotective. At its most extreme, it resulted in broken homes, whether from neglect, substance misuse, domestic violence, or in my case, being placed in foster care and adopted. Scholars and global institutions like the United Nations have taken up the study of intergenerational transmission of trauma, especially trauma caused by genocides such as the Cambodian genocide and the Holocaust. A common theme emerging from this growing body of research suggests that while not totally indicative of outcomes for children of survivors, intergenerational trauma may be transmitted most recognizably in the way we metabolize stress and at a greater risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. Much of the work around intergenerational trauma and its intersection with epigenetics is thanks in large part to researchers who study Holocaust survivors and their offspring. I'm going to skip the academic part. In diving into the direct research done on the Cambodian population in America, I found a scientific explanation for the sense of duty and responsibility that I mentioned earlier. In my case, I experienced role reversal parenting, in which the parent survivor turns to the child to have their emotional and personal needs met. In this case, my biological mom was relying on me, at the time, a 7, 8-year-old, to take care of her. As one group of researchers found, there's a strong correlation between parent survivors who show trauma-related symptoms, role reversal, and an increase in likelihood and levels of anxiety and depression among their children. Having to provide emotional and personal support to my birth mother at a very young age, as well as caring for, to the extent possible, my younger siblings, helped to shape who I am today. This added a layer on top of the Cambodian cultural values around collectivism and family, and an extra layer on top of my personal instincts and inclinations, as is described to me by those who knew me in my early childhood. And so what that section was all about was part of the reason why I am who I am today is not only because of a noble inkling or noble characteristic that I want to help people. It gets to the question of, I'm sure you all are familiar with the concept of nature versus nurture. I don't think it's a either or. I think it's both. So for me, I think there was an inkling to help people from a very young age, but I think my experiences with my mother and with my family, having to take care of her very early, gave me sort of a sense of obligation and duty to my family, not only from a cultural perspective, but from a basic just having to take care of my mom. And obviously, when you fast forward to who I am today, when you see my community volunteer service, leading the Cambodian Community Association, making the choice to run for office and losing my hair, stressing out about the Charter Commission or being on the planning board or being on this board or that board. You know, a lot of it is informed by both wanting to help people, but also being put in a place where, I had to help so many different people along the way. And for me, making peace with that is understanding that this world is in need of saving by so many people in so many different ways. And how I've made peace with that is that I felt alone taking care of my mom, or taking care of my siblings. But the thing about being an adult now and having time to reflect on it and meet so many people is that every human being has the capacity to help and the capacity to make a difference in other people's lives. And for me, it makes it so much easier thinking about the world in that way. That unlike my situation with my mom, I'm not there alone trying to help my mom out. In today's situation, and dealing with climate change and dealing with a poverty or food insecurity, which is the work I do now. The work isn't done alone. It's done with each and every person that I come into contact with. And I think that was the crux of that passage was I was dealing with the emotions and the feelings of, okay, I'm the son of so many different people. Son of my biological mother, the son of my godparents, son of my foster families. So I still keep in touch with my first foster family. And the son of my adopted parents. And the feelings I was struggling with then at the time was, how the hell am I going to afford 4 sets of retirements or 4 sets of parents? And less has become about how will I manage to take care of not only my parents, but other people in the world. And more it became, there's a village of people, there's communities of people now. And I think that's what we need to realize is there's a little bit of ego involved in thinking that we are facing problems alone and that we can solve problems alone. A little bit of ego, a little bit of pride. But letting that go and realizing I can lean on other people to help solve a problem. I can collaborate. I can be a part of a group to see change and to make change. I think is the better way to live because it's less stressful, one. Humans can be dramatic, but I think overall the work can be less stressful. But when you're not the only one at the table coming up with ideas of how to solve issues, so many things become easier because there's a room full of people with good ideas. And there's a room full of people who also want to help. And so I'll end it on that note because Hannah Young is on our Food Equity and Justice Collaborative at the Good Shepherd Food Bank, which is a group of 10 people who we've had join in our sort of process to figure out how do we work with communities of color to address the issues of food insecurity and the disparities that different communities of color face when it comes to food insecurity. And so I'll end it there and I'll have Hannah come back up and have a little chat.
Well, thank you, Marpheen. Let's give them a little round of applause for. I'm gonna take a little break here and switch a little gears because I'm betting we have some English majors here and some folks who are interested in writing in general and learning a little bit about your process. In reading your book, I found it incredibly well researched, and it felt like it must have taken you years to go back and relive some of the trauma and find the stories. Could you tell us a little bit more about your process?
Don't get scared, English people. It took me 8 years to write this book. But that's to Hannah's point about writing about trauma. And even though it was stuff I'd already processed for the most part, when you process trauma, and let's take journaling for instance. When they ask you to journal stuff, that's a process of visually and sort of symbolically taking something, putting it down on paper, and hopefully forgetting about it. But writing a memoir was like I had processed something, I'd written something down, I had filed it away in the back of my head, compressed it, like computers do. And having to write about it in a memoir, you kind of have to make it something that people can connect to, you have to bring out all the details of sights, sounds, tastes, smells to the best of your memory. And so imagine taking something that you had both happy memories, but also sad memories and angry memories, dark memories, and taking those and having to unpack them all again. It's like opening up a can of worms. And so for me, the 8 years was a good pace for me because it allowed me to get my story straight, my facts straight, but also allowed me time to put it down, pick it up at my own pace. Because if you're dealing with something so traumatic, like I think I judged a recent part of the main literary awards, some youth writers. And one of the writers wrote about something that's super heavy, how as a young child, another boy her age or slightly older abused her. And some people will say it's kid things, kids experimenting, figuring out stuff like that. And for me, I sat there like, how did she write about this? Like, and so for people who write memoirs, it's a radical act of self-care continually on a continual basis. And so take your time with it. And sometimes today, what people do is if you look at Morgan Talty, you look at Ocean Vuong, who's a poet and writer, they found a way to write it as if it was fiction, but it has very real elements of the writer in their lives. So I find that would be useful for people who want to write about traumatic experiences, but don't necessarily want to rehash a lot of those things. Obviously, it can still trigger, but I think if you're looking for inspiration, look to Morgan Talty's Night of the Living Res or Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is like a long poem bio kind of story. So that was a little bit of the writing process. It was very long, but I needed to take that time because the first version of the book that I submitted was very much dates and facts. This is what happened, this is how I dealt with it. But my editor was like, you need to like infuse emotion into it. And that was the part I was scared about. But I think going in at a slow pace allowed me to do it in a way that I could practice self-care.
I think that is definitely a scary part, and it seems like as I read the book, that was those are the pieces I connected with the most, or I could kind of see the cut and dry of how things cascaded in your life, but having the emotion around that helped me better understand you and better understand what you were up against in your area as you were trying to change and assimilate and code switch and do all of the things you needed to do for survival. As you launched your book, it took you 8 years to write it. Now you've published it and it's out there. Did you find that you had hard conversations with folks? Because those are some really personal stories, not just for you, but for their lives as well. Is that difficult?
It's funny because my adopted mom, I wasn't sure what my adoptive parents would think when I dropped the book off. They're okay with it, yes. My mom, the only comment she had was, "Oh, you didn't ask me permission to use that photo." And I was like, okay, if that's the only thing she's worried about.
Sounds like a absolute win to me.
But the harder part was talking with my biological family. Trying to figure out what did my grandmother and my mother actually go through. And for me, it was like, okay, I know a lot of the facts, I know a lot of the history, I know a lot of the things that can be dug up through some Google searching and books. But I wanted the personal side of what did my grandmother go through, what did my mom go through, without realizing that I was asking them to do a lot, to relive such horrors. And my grandmother was just like, nope. And that's why that part where that I read where, people just avoid the subject. I think that was the hardest thing to do, was not really get closure on what exactly did my grandmother, my mom experience. But what helped was, again, a lot of research, but a particular article that focused on Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge's use of ritual as part of their communist ideology. And I think in that article was where they would separate the kids from their families, put them in education camps, and then they would force the kids to recite speeches, sing songs, and do all these sort of ritual things that would basically brainwash them. And one of the things that they did both with kids and adults was they forced the kids and the adults, if you hear anyone saying anything that might go against the ruling regime and the ideology, then you need to report them. So you had kids reporting family members, and those family members being taken away, killed, or whatnot. And for the adults, you had neighbors turning on each other, friends turning on each other. While it wasn't a complete personal picture of what my grandmother and my mom went through, it helped me to understand why my mom's relationship with my grandmother was also strained. Because you heard that my godparents were sort of like my first foster parent. I ended up living with them as a toddler. And the question for me was, well, why didn't I go live with my grandmother? It was because my mom had a very fraught relationship with my grandmother because of the distrust and the mistrust that was baked into their relationship by Rouge and the trauma that they endured. So I think that was probably one of the toughest pieces to cover.
Well, I don't want to run out of time here, so I wanted to give an opportunity. Does anyone in the audience have any questions that you'd like answered?
So I'm very interested in narrative, and I talk to students a lot about being able to kind of restructure the narrative that they've kind of accepted. So, you know, often students who have struggled in school or other things and internalize different language about their identity or their potential.
Yeah.
So I like this whole idea of being able to think about like how those words really shape you. I'm curious,
Yeah.
did your mother and grandmother, were they speaking Cambodian? Did they speak English, and how did that multilingual piece affect your story?
Yeah.
Or not?
So Cambodian was my first language. Growing up, I spoke so much Cambodian that in second or third grade, they were like, okay, when you come to school, like you need to stop speaking Cambodian. And you can do it when you go home, but like here you need to speak English. So that's just like the level to like how much I was speaking Cambodian in school. And so my mom and grandmother don't speak fluent English at all. Like, it's very broken. And so for me, I always have to rely on my uncles and relatives to kind of translate or interpret. And so that was one of the tough things in middle school and high school, because my parents adopted parents did try to keep us somewhat connected. But for me, I had such an issue with needing an interpreter to be there. And for me, part of the shame was I should be able to talk to my mom, but I wasn't. And so eventually they just stopped having this connect. So that was the other thing that was tough about getting them to talk about their stories, because the language barrier was just there. And so language and cultural and traumatic barriers for them. Yeah. And 8 years isn't enough time to get them.
So you're saying you're working on a second book?
Maybe. I mean, there's a few ideas going to that. I won't spoil it.
Anybody else have questions?
I'm not always you, but I kept having what if moments. And I wonder if you do, you know, what if I had chosen to go to Texas, or what if I've been able to stay with Mark and Debbie, and you know, what if those sort of things. And
Yeah. I did a lot of that during the writing of the book. And I think in the part about, wrestling with the question as a 3 or 4 year old, when my godparents would move to Texas, when I was reflecting on that as an adult, I was like, what if I went to Texas with them? I'd have a Texas accent. But it was just it was a good thought experiment to kind of figure out what kind of kid I would become and how I would grow up. And then the same thing with Mark and Debbie, who was sort of like, what kind of life would that have been? And for me, I think there's one line in there where it says, but nostalgia is a regret is replaced by nostalgia. Nostalgia is replaced by sort of my experiences today, who I'm connected with today, and all the people I've met since then. And And in thinking about sort of the relationships I had with my best friend that I crushed on in high school, like, even though, we didn't have like the perfect love story and like, he ended up gay too or something like that, like just the act and the experience of loving him that way. You still don't want to miss out on that. So if I had gone to Texas, I wouldn't have met Travis, or I wouldn't have met other friends, and I wouldn't have gone to do what I do today. Um, life would have just veered off so many different ways, and rather than risking like what might have become, just reflecting on, especially the people that I've met along. I think it's important. And now I'm very connected with my three younger siblings who were also adopted by the same family. If I had gone with my godparents, my mom would have probably gone to Portland still and then had the three other kids. And so I probably wouldn't have been as connected to them. And now my sister says, I have two nephews, 5 and 3. My little brother Brandon has 2 little girls, 4 and 2, with a boy on the way. And then my sister Kanya just had a baby boy a few months ago. And so it's those things like that keep me tied to the, not to use Marvel multiverse language, but keeps me tied to the current time.
Speaking of the current timeline, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about your politics and your career there, and really what pushed you to. That's a huge amount of effort, and really putting yourself out there and putting a spotlight on you. You and I have talked a little bit about being a person of color in Maine, and it's a little bit different when you also have another identity on top of that makes you a target. And
Yeah,
can we talk a little bit about that?
I think politics, what drew me to politics was the idea that you could work with people to make something happen. But I'm also a romantic in many different ways, and I idealize a lot of different things, and then I actually do something, and turns out it's not quite as rosy as it seems. And politics, you can still achieve a lot of change, you can still work with a lot of different people, but today, I think what politics does is it brings out both the best, also the worst in people. And one of the worst thing that it brings out is it's easy to see people and tell yourself, tell each other stories about particular people. And for me, navigating both left and right, progressives and conservative, navigating how I tell my story, my identity, intersectionality, which are tied to my values and inform my values, to navigate politics and for people to say, stop with identity politics. You talk too much about identity, but you don't talk much about the economy, working class issues. I was like, but hang on, if you listen to my story when I talk about my identity, you'll also hear the strains where I was adopted by a working class family, I grew up in poverty. Those are as much part of my identity as me being gay, as me being Asian. And if you took the time to actually listen, then you'll hear through my stories that I care about poverty, I care about working class issues. But I think both on left and the right, and on the far right and on the far left, it's sort of like a lot of single storytelling about, on the far right, it's sort of like, oh, these people just want to take over a country and turn it into God knows what, and then on the left, it's like everyone just needs to talk about working class issues. We're all part of the proletariat and just be a nice little puddle of workers and advocate for all the same things. And it's like there's no humanity in either argument. The humanity is so sapped out of it, and the complexity of narrative and individual stories is what brings people to the table. And so I think that's been one of the toughest challenges is in a polarized politics of today. How do you make room for human complexity, both in terms of identity, but also in terms of thought and ideas? And I think that the way that not allowing that complexity has forced people to the margins, so that we're planting our flags on either side and just shooting at each other with very, very, I think, harmful interpretive. So that's how I feel about politics today. And I'm like pretty progressive, but like but it's just interesting to see, you know, how people just don't want to hear anyone out. They just want to make their point and then just move on. And granted, there are some real jerks out there who you want to just tell it as it is and walk away, but I think for the majority of people, digging into story and complexity is what's needed to move the needle issues.
Any other questions that have come up? I had a bunch today, and I know you all are talkers. I have a note here. Talk with me a little bit about reconnecting with your culture, and how hard or easy that might be for you now as an adult trying to come back to where you should, embracing this a little bit more.
It's tough, it's uncomfortable, but if there's one thing I learned about my life, it's a lot of discomfort, a lot of not being comfortable. And so, just, I don't want to overuse the word resilient, but resilience and perseverance. I used to hate public speaking in college, but when I was like 20-year-old, 21-year-old, I was like, if I want to be successful, I need to like fix this. And so what I did was like, okay, like do those student group presentations, need to like find a way to like cope and manage. And lo and behold, became a better public speaker. Becoming a better public speaker then led me to where I am today. And so with culture, not knowing the language, I'm slowly picking up Cambodian again. But for me, it was sort of like, I'm never going to learn Cambodian again if I don't immerse myself some way. So jumping head over heels into the role of president of the Cambodian Community Association would not have been my first thought, but people, there's no one else, so you got to do it. And it was tough. Like going to the Cambodian temple, not being able to speak the language, sitting in front of 8 to 10 elders of the temple who you feel like are looking down on you for not knowing your language or not caring about your heritage in a way. And finding ways to bridge the generational gap as well, in the cultural gap, has been such an eye-opening learning experience. But making it two ways. They're learning from me about the nonprofit world, about advocacy, about how do you host an event in a public park and fill out the permits and get the insurance, get the sponsorships to do it.
And at the same time, I'm learning from them, you know, no one eats before the monks break their fast, for instance. Which kind of happened at the last festival. But it was just sort of human nature where we wanted to give the mayor of Westbrook a little bit of food before he left. And everyone else saw him grabbing food, so they rushed to the table to eat food, but in doing so, they broke the rule of let the monks break their fast first. Things like that I don't learn unless I'm engaged and immersed in it. And so I don't have the benefit of having grown up in that from the very beginning, and so it's definitely challenging. But again, life isn't always comfort, so I have to lean into that.
I think we find our growth in the hard parts. There's a like really good quote about that I'm getting wrong.
For my book?
There's something that
Yeah.
I'll email it to you later.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up on 1 o'clock and folks have other places to be. I can ask one more question, or we can kind of give folks a chance to meet you if you'd like, and chat a little bit more.
There is a nice quote of that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Classic Gemini.
Where, adversity, and you can live life, I'm paraphrasing my own book, but you can live life, feeling like it's throwing a bunch of lemons at you. But, the real power as an adult is really realizing that you do still have some agency, not all complete agency, not complete control over circumstances, but you have some. And to quote, quotes from the Buddhist tradition, like, you have the power to control your responses. And for me, that always is cycling there. So like, things can happen, things can look like they change everything, but how you respond to it and how you manage change, disruption, crisis, and everything that's thrown at you is also within your control. So that's another big lesson that I like to pass on. As you know, from facilitating a group, not everyone is able to, be there all at the same time. Not everyone has the same schedule. And my supervisor always said, how do you do that? So everyone on this group is human. Like, they have kids, they have jobs, they have, especially in Maine where we're very focused on diversity and equity now, like people of color are like being overtapped so many different things. And so once you realize that, then you're like, it's not about me proving to my bosses that I can bring 10 people to the table all at once and have them attend every single meeting, which is an ego thing, a pride thing. It's me like, okay, we're all human. I don't have kids, so I don't understand what it's like to be a parent and to juggle daycare and these types of things. I don't, and so for me, it's bringing humanity to the workplace as well. That's allowed me to kind of do my work well.
Perfectly said. Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very-